Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you happenstance into this dialogue, I am so pleased and honored to be joined by, on my far left, William K. Black, former criminologist and professor of law and economics at the University of Kansas City, Missouri, as well as University of Minnesota, but most prolifically involved with what proved was government's capacity to be able to deal with high level financial fraud, which we're all in the midst of at the moment, that we're going to draw attention to and pull you into an understanding of three to many more ways to be able to improve the situation that we're all unfortunately being overwhelmed by at the moment. To his right is his compatriot, his lifelong partner in all, and a woman who is a scholar and a resident at she's the Rabina Chair at the University of Minnesota. And I will put down, her name is June Carbone, and I will put her book, Fair Shake, a link to it in the description, as well as to about 80 academic papers that are unbelievably illuminating. But I think I want to get right into it, guys. And I just want to start with something that was stuck in my craw for a couple of days now that was part of Rachel Maddow's sort of analysis the other day when she was trying to deconstruct a real understanding of what she was looking at by way of Elon Musk's involvement with Doge and all things matter, shape, or form being involved with all of things that we're going to discuss right now. And she made this comment. She said, it's as if Elon was a bank robber and chose to buy the bank. Immediately, I was set off in a trajectory that was amazing because the sum total of my work, which of course those of you who follow and hopefully further more people will understand, that we created a long form television series called The Con, which is available at www.thecon.tv, but that followed really the information of a previous era by way of what William K. Black was in the midst of, that spans from the savings and loan crisis in the era of the late 80s, early 90s, that created what became literally the next 40 years. And all of the people in media are not, quite frankly, aware of. And your seminal book, Bill, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One, certainly put all of that into stark focus. And I think the conversation that we're about to involve, we should start potentially with what looks like a celebration of sorts of the principles of SDNY's refusal to participate in bowing to Pam Bondi, our new Attorney General's initiative to quash the investigation into Eric Adams. I wonder if you guys can both comment, and maybe starting with Bill, on your reaction to what we saw yesterday with Ms. Sassoon, Daniel Sassoon, who is a Republican, and her letter, of course, as well as the folks from the Public Integrity Unit of the Department of Justice. What does that mean to you guys?
Okay, so first, both of us were Justice Department attorneys in the federal programs branch of the Civil Division. So we are particularly familiar with these kinds of issues. And isn't it a rich irony that what they tried to do was to get the public integrity section to sanction corruption?
Unbelievable.
They not only want Eric Adams to get away with corruption, they want to use the threat of prosecution to ensure he will stay corrupt, corrupt in the way that they want him to be corrupt, so that he will betray the people of New York City. So the key thing about the dismissal is it's without prejudice is what they want. That means it can be brought again. That means it's over Eric Adams' head like a sword of Damocles for all time to ensure he'll do exactly what they want. And indeed, when we were both young lawyers, certainly for me, one of the most important experiences was the Saturday Night Massacre, right? In which President Nixon, who was the subject of the criminal investigation because he was the lead criminal, a theme that we'll talk about. What happens when the big boss is the crook? Now you get not just criminality, but a form of criminality that is massively more harmful and which the odds of getting away with it are much greater, and in which he will corrupt not just himself, but vast ranges of activity. And there were all kinds of corruption. He was, deliberately using the IRS to target his political opponents and such. So corruption of this kind doesn't stay limited, it spreads throughout the government. Well, in that case, the two most senior officials in the Department of Justice refused to go along with his criminal cover up. And the number three guy, Bork, of infamy in other regards, destroying a big part of our ability to prosecute companies and very rich people for antitrust violations, agreed to do the deed, but that resignation. So the two most senior Justice Department officials led spontaneously to people going out onto the streets immediately with signs, honk if you want the corrupt guy gone, type of thing. And tens of thousands of people were honking. So you created a public resistance through the actions of people who are being ethical and who are willing to make this huge sacrifice of giving up their dream positions in life in order for America, type of thing. So have been probably talking a bit. I'll stop at that point, but this resonates in a bunch of different areas.
Yeah, June, based on your incredible deep dive into this over the course of decades, and your new book definitely takes a part of this, or it looks into a lot of the elements of this in Fair Shake Women in the Fight to Build a Just Economy. I recall that you have begun a lot of your analysis with elements that took place in the time period that both you and Bill were in the midst of, particularly in the 80s, as it relates to a CEO by the name of Jack Welch. Can you maybe draw a bridge between that time period and what you had learned from that and what we're seeing unfold at the moment?
Sure. And there's a new book, not mine, out called about how Jack Welch broke capitalism. But what Jack Welch is really famous for is the theorist, think Milton Friedman, was writing as early as 1962 that corporations should exist to profit their shareholders and no one else. That shift in corporate management really started with Jack Welch in the 80s. So until then, there was the idea of the CEO as steward of the company, um, to protect the company's long-term interests, responsible to multiple stakeholders, to customers, to employees. The idea that companies' long-term fortunes rested on the shoulders of the CEO, and that the duty was to guide the ship of the company successfully through time. And if you look in 1960, the same companies dominated the top 10 in the United States as in 1910. Not all that dynamic. Well, that began to change with Jack Welch. So he became CEO of General Electric, one of the largest companies, and an iconic company. Dates back to Thomas Edison, one of the iconic companies in the United States. The first thing he does is fire 25% of the workforce within a couple of years. He then buys and sells whole divisions. He implements a new management system called rank and yank. Evaluate all of your workers compared to each other every year. Top 20% or so get outside bonuses. At the height of the system, maybe two-thirds of total salary would come from the bonus. So everyone is insecure. Everyone is being ranked every year, if not every quarter in some cases. Bottom 10% fired every year. So everybody is insecure. And then who do you promote? Not the next in line, not the quote old boys, end quote, who are have lots of experience, protect the way we, GE, do things, the ethos of the company. No, you reach down into the ranks. You predict, you promote what I call the New Boys Club. The new boys are designed to break through the bureaucracy, outflank the old boys, and Jack Welch liked to brag, do whatever the CEO wants. So, how does he pick them? He talks about picking people who are brimming with confidence. Read that as hubris. You move people around every 2 years, different cities, different divisions, into areas they know nothing about. What is their mission? Cut costs. And so you move into a division you know nothing about. You cut costs, you fire people, and then you move on to another job. In the meantime, having left the division on paper, it looks like it's producing higher earnings because you cut costs. But down the road, after you cut the training program, after you cut the quality controls, you know, Boeing was the CEO was one of Jack Welch's acolytes. In fact, they've had several of Jack Welch's acolytes. These are people who come from GE. They go to Boeing. They know nothing about airplanes. They cut costs. Share price goes up. CEO looks golden. Everybody's bonuses go up, and planes crash. So
and
this
and people die.
this system, which is implemented at one point, it was thought more than half of publicly traded companies implemented the Jack Welch model. Since then, that's changed, but mostly they get rid of the yank part. You don't necessarily fire 10% of your workforce every year. But the idea of high stakes bonuses and of moving people around to different divisions in which they have no expertise every 2 years or so, that's still very common throughout corporate America. And again, it's bottom line reductionist thinking that allows the CEO to impose his stamp on the company. You can use it to produce whatever the CEO wants.
I'm only smiling because does that not project and illuminate exactly what I think we just saw Elon Musk do as the shadow president? And it's not funny, but it's ridiculous in so much of what we've seen by way of obviously thousands of layoffs are happening today in the federal government, but we literally saw the takeover of the Treasury, manifested through Elon Musk, but with a bunch of 20 somethings with, you know, names such as big balls, for example. What you just described seemed to be a complete reflection of what we've seen the past 2 weeks from Elon Musk.
Our shock of recognition was, and we open our book with Elon Musk, but the shock of recognition that these are the same tactics. He used to take over Twitter. Jack Welch used to get control of GE. And the rest of Silicon Valley so liked what Musk did at Twitter, which, by the way, decimated the company. Much less efficient, much less effective in all kinds of things, but well, he cut ad revenue too, so I won't say more profitable, but his control on the company was immediate.
Well, Bill, I mean, that dovetails brilliantly into obviously everything that we've learned from you that set the tone for our work, vis-a-vis control fraud. But I think that so much is being illuminated by what Trump's engagement and Elon and so forth say about all of these methodologies that you've been revealing now for decades. Can you comment about what Trump's cabinet and agencies picks say about his so-called anti-corruption agenda, considering the source?
Sure. And the whole concept of their bringing expertise, excellence, that he's a genius, and such. So we haven't yet explained what control fraud and predation is. It's when the CEO, title doesn't matter, it's whoever ever has actual control over the corporation or the government entity or both, which is what we're seeing today, uses this seemingly legitimate, emphasis on the word seemingly, entity as camouflage, as a sword, and as a shield. So, to expand on what Jack Welch did, well, Jack Welch insisted that you always what's hit the number, Now that what that means is you hit what the forecasted profits are, or you exceed it. And then your stock rises a whole bunch because you exceeded expectations, and everybody gets big bonuses. Well, you could do that by expertise, but that'd be really hard. Or you could do it by accounting fraud, and that would be really easy. And it would be a sure thing, right? And that's what we emphasize, that accounting is typically the weapon of choice, as it was for Jack Welch, who was so brazen, he put it in his supposed autobiographies that were really written, by ghostwriters in large part. But he would put anecdotes in of this top guy that he put in, and Frank, I love you, but if you ever miss the number again, you're gone. Right?
Right.
So you have to hit the number. You don't have the ability to hit the number. You don't have any particular skills as a manager, except a skill that you're willing to cheat and lie. And that is the key in these kinds of lieutenants. Plus, it was all Potemkin. Potemkin, is a fake village facade. You think of it like a Hollywood set where it's made to look grand, but it's just a couple, it's plywood out in front. And in this case, this was a facade for he was changing GE, the great industrial company, into a financial company. More than 60% of its purported revenues, much of which were fake, came from finance, particularly the kind of finance that was building up to cause the great financial crisis. In other words, fraudulent home lending through liar's loans that, if people look at the con, they will learn about in enormous degree. Okay. But Jack Welch got to be so famous by doing this, by always hitting the number or exceeding it, no matter what the circumstances. Isn't that amazing that you can always hit or exceed the number, that the idiot financial press named him the CEO of the century? And then he was smart enough to leave before it all collapsed personally and write books about how he was a genius um, and such. So these people's great skill, they have one great skill, and that is audacity. And that's what you see in Musk and what you see in Trump. That's why Musk, after he buys Twitter and ruins Twitter, destroys $40 billion in purported value, will give a press conference in which he says, F the advertisers, the people that give him the money and such. And as June explained, it was actually over 60% of America's top companies publicly disclosed in their annual filings that they had adopted this rank and yank nonsense. But why do you use rank and yank? You use rank and yank to make sure that you promote the worst people, incentivize the worst people, but you never have to have the speech that sends you to prison. You don't have to say, I want you to do the following sleazy thing, and in return, I will give you money. You just create a compensation system. And when people invent profits out of things that actually cause massive losses, as long as they can account for it as a gain, you give them a huge bonus. And this is the quintessential thing that was the savings and loan debacle. Those the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal before, but also was the Enron scandal. Enron used rank and yank. And what you did in particular, as June was saying, you took children. Does this sound familiar? Very, very young people. And you sold them that they were the best in the world. So this was the best and the brightest, supposedly. But what they were the best and brightest at was lying, right? That was the key skill set. And so they did deal after deal after deal, all of which had two common characteristics. One, they actually lost massive amounts of money because the smartest guys in the room, that was the type, were actually not very bright at all and had no experience in business. Uh, and of course, you claimed huge gains. Well, how did you claim huge gains? Because you put your CFO, the chief financial officer, on both sides of the deal. So he was and representing supposedly Enron, and then he was selling to entities that were supposedly independent, which were entirely Enron. But by the way, with the aid of the world's largest banks who knew the scam was going on. And Alan Greenspan refused to do anything about it, by the way. Okay, so I'm selling to myself. Can I sell at a profit? A purported profit. And that's what drove all of Enron's revenues. But it does something else. It actually does two things. We're talking about 22-year-olds, right? Again, with Elon. What does a 22-year-old do when you give him a $200,000 bonus? He
More.
runs out immediately and gets a hot car because it's a dweeb and he wants to get women, right? And he thinks this is what's going to do it for him finally. And he parks it in the public lot, right? Now, and he does some stupid nameplate that is like the equivalent of balls, airy balls and such, right?
Yeah.
Now, within 2 days, everybody in Enron knows that this nebbish, pretending to be someone, a genius, was rewarded massively. That's the point of it. And they don't go, my God. Well, some of them, the honest ones, did actually leave. But
Right.
that's the good thing.
They were principled.
Again, the ranking yank is not designed to create quality. It's designed to create the opposite.
The
It's
words.
around to keep the liars rising to the top and the whistleblowers, the would-be whistleblowers, you want to yank them. So it's in jargon, it's a kakistocracy. It's ruled by the worst people as opposed to the best. So that's the other thing. You want to deter the honest people. You want them to leave. What we were just discussing, who are the people leaving the administration? The
Those that are principled.
most competent and the most honest people that if you actually wanted to save money, to make government more efficient, you would make your leaders. Because you know what? What's true about the IRS, the Department of Justice, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, the Securities and Exchange Commission? They all make money. They don't lose money. They make massive amounts of money. And we know, David K. Johnston is one of the experts in the world, how we could make much more money by cracking down on fraud by the billionaire class, which the Republicans in Congress have for 30 years denied us the resources and or tried to push the IRS to focus not on billionaires, but on literally the poorest taxpayers, on the earned income tax credit. These are folks making $8,000, $12,000 a year. So we know how to make the government much more efficient. And he's taking exactly those people that know and who have dedicated their lives to doing so and saying, I want you gone immediately, because this is just, again, Potemkin. We're not for efficiency. Just like Enron, we want to create a system in which we get rid of the honest people, we get rid of the competent people, and we get people who are loyal to the dear leader. Now, the question is, who's the real dear leader? Elon, who's the real president, or Trump, the sort of ceremonial president?
So,
Um,
yeah.
can I just bridge this real quick to you, June? Because I know this, but this is the whole purpose of us recording and then to build this and hopefully do this week in and week out so that people understand. First and foremost, I've been saying this for some time that had Bill Black been the attorney general going back, quite frankly, decades, but particularly during the Obama administration moving forward, we wouldn't be in this unbelievable disaster. But as a bridge, because you guys have been in the game now for decades, in what Bill taught us long ago is it's not necessary to hope to persevere, and there's never an absolute victory. But we are in late stages of democracy, if we could even call it that, which I frequently say we don't have a democracy because of all of the elements that are involved. But when you pick up upon what Bill just laid out, I'm reminded in your work, June, for example, as it relates to what we just saw in terms of kneecapping the budgets for USAID and all of the elements of what the federal government does to protect the most vulnerable in society and around the world, quite frankly, given what I just prefaced. But there seems to be an overwhelming abomination when the world's richest man was worth 240 plus $billion before the election. He sinks $277 million into the campaign. Of course, I'm referring to Elon Musk. He purchases Twitter, not with all of his own money. There's a consortium of, too big to fail banks. There's hedge funds. There's Saudi sovereign wealth fund. Apparently, there's a couple of oligarchs from Russia that are involved. They're all in the game, that of course Twitter has lost its value, i.e. X, but then what we saw with Musk was on paper, his net worth has gone up $170 billion literally since the election. And we're not even digging into that because we're so overwhelmed with this complete water cannon of misinformation, disinformation, the worst of the worst cabinet picks and everything else that nobody can seem to catch up to what you're telling us, guys, is the sort of blueprint and the calculus of what we have known about for now decades. Can you kind of explore, June, some of those elements and react to it, particularly from your focus of research?
Sure. Let's start. I mean, there are all kinds of big lies. And one of the most basic is the idea the government can't do anything. You go back to Ronald Reagan and the idea that and some of the tax cutters of the Reagan era who talked about reducing government to the size of something that could fit in a bathtub and be drowned. Okay,
Strangled.
and that idea, the government is the enemy. Okay, that comes from people who want complete freedom to rip you off. So when I go back and I look historically, you see the rise of manufacturing, the industrial era giants, and then the ruthless titans of finance, in FDR's words, who caused the Great Depression. And the counterpoint, starting with the progressive era, is big government to offset the power of big business. The other thing government does is to even out the financial cycles. So you go back and to say 1900, and you look at how people are incredibly insecure, how manufacturing jobs are dirty, dangerous, how Ford Motor Company has 377% turnover in 1913. And what ultimately happens, a variety of things, including unionization, Henry Ford's adoption of the family wage, but starting with the New Deal, the systemization of Social Security, unemployment compensation, a variety of other protections, which the Supreme Court initially found were unconstitutional. And then you get a change after that. And what takes place is that you get a secure society that limits the power of the capitalists to rip you off and cause financial crises and brings up the bottom with a greater degree of security only with the creation of large government. But that large government hamstrings the capitalists. And back when we were at the Justice Department in the 70s, and certainly Bill heard this in dealing with the savings and loan crisis, there were all these stories. And today, Neil Gorsuch peddles the stories of the poor fishermen and the regulators who come and prosecute him because he has these large nets and he's just trying to make a living. And it turns out some of the fish are undersized. Well, Gorsuch doesn't tell the full story, which is the guy is deliberately destroying evidence, is deliberately indifferent to making any effort to comply with the regulations. And what are the regulations designed to do? Preserve the fishing stock for all the fishermen. It's all a lie. I mean, the lie part is you have this nice story about the poor person beset by government regulations, when in fact, the poor person who gets prosecuted tends to be a pretty egregious actor. And that's almost always left out of the horror stories. But the most important story that is not told are the things government is doing. So I was on a phone call yesterday with a big research organization. I won't mention the name, but their research budget has been cut like in the middle of running a trial that involves children. And all of a sudden it's cut overnight. That they want to increase the amount of money, that researchers, they want to reduce the amount of compensation big universities get. There have been squeals from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, which is one of the biggest employers in Alabama. The government is everywhere. And when you apply a sledgehammer to it, what you are making visible, something that has deliberately been made invisible. Because, in fact, the government supplies the infrastructure, the funding for public schools, the ability of children with disabilities to remain, who are incredibly expensive to educate, to allow them to be educated. If you go back to the 30s, they simply dropped out at a young age, or weren't in school in the first place because there were no resources to devote to their education. That you've got the infrastructure for research throughout the United States. Yes, the big Silicon Valley companies research the thing that will give you a payoff tomorrow, but they are not going to research that which pays off in 10 years. When you look at the Jack Welch methods, and I did a series of interviews with people at various companies, and remarkably, it was the same story. It was, hey, we had the best training system for mechanics in all of Kansas City. The first thing the suits, the new ambitious executives coming in under new ownership did is to cut the training program. Won't have any effect this year. 5 years from now, we will no longer be the best trained group of machinists in Kansas City. Silicon Valley company, the first thing the suits did was to cut our research program. They only wanted research on things that you could commercialize within 6 months. If the development was going to take 5 years to get to market, it's gone. That's the mindset Musk is applying to government. So who took up the slack? Government funding funds the basic research that doesn't pay off immediately. And when you look at the people in government, I was always astounded by my colleagues at Justice, because what you got were people coming into the honors program who are often top of their class at regional law schools or had gone to really good law schools. And these are folks who have the credentials. They could have walked into jobs with law firms paying 3 times as much. They were coming to the government because they believed in public service. And my colleagues were incredibly competent. I mean, they were very good lawyers who got a lot of experience at fairly young ages, but then understood how it was different to be a lawyer for the government than for a private firm, and had a great deal of integrity, including the ability to say no to clients, which is something private law firms used to do and do a lot less in the modern era. And our rule of thumb was what we call the laugh test. We would not go into court and make arguments you couldn't justify. And what you see by Justice Department attorneys in this administration is going into court and making ridiculous arguments that are either untrue, um, that Mayor Adams, for example, that there's no quid pro quo. Oh, come on. There is no express quid pro quo. There is an implicit quid pro quo that Bill explained. But we would not make arguments like that in front of a court as a matter of professional integrity. And so that's the missing thing. It is Republicans own the day on what the messaging is about government. And what Musk is doing is making visible the fact that the government infrastructure is what makes the economy run.
So let me tag on that. When you talk to David K. Johnston, he's one of the world's experts on the two hit jobs the Republicans did on the IRS with complete fake stories of outrages and the cowardice of Bill Clinton in going along with the first of these hit jobs and such rather than countering it. So in my day, we always, as a savings and loan regulator, my phrase was the highest return on assets is always a political contribution, right? For these fraudulent places. And they did try to literally take over the federal agency. And President Reagan tried to help them do it. And it was only random politics that led us by the sliver from being taken over. We were just one agency. Now their ambitions are much greater. Now they want to take over the entire government. And something that we just had a hint of, reporters at the Washington Post in our era who were in the pockets of, or at least highly favorable to the worst fraudsters, we were going, why in God's name? Well, in that case, they were just the best sources, right? And they would lie, and so that was all useful. And the Reagan administration would amplify the lies instead of answering the lies. But it was a rarer thing then. Now, the highest return on assets is a political contribution and getting one of these fake journalists in key positions. And of course, this is the rise of Fox News in particular, which didn't really exist in the same way when we were young. And as people have often observed, Nixon would not have been forced from office if there had been a Fox News in his era. And so you have tens of thousands of people in media in which their sole function is to lie consistently. That's how you get the job. You're willing to lie about anything. You're willing to spin anything.
And that's the reason we had to make the con, right? And that's the miracle that we happened to find you when I discovered you, and I just realized it was 15 years ago when you had done the interview with Bill Moyers that fateful day that made everything make sense, and all of a sudden the clouds parted, and I saw the light, right? Because based on what June was talking about, and to pick up on your colleague David K. Johnson, he has told us, Bill, together, and I've heard him separately in many other interviews over the course of, a lot of time. And Mr. Johnson has been probably the foremost expert on all things Trump going back decades. But he's pointed out time and time again how many times that Trump should have been in the crosshairs of prosecutors, or the type of stuff that SDNY would be investigating, throughout. But he always avoided the ultimate conviction, right? He was never held accountable, and it got worse and worse and worse throughout this whole time period. And now you dovetail that because of his transactional nature, right? With all things, the mechanics of what the Koch brothers had infused by way of Project 2025 that comes out of the Heritage, think tanks and so on and so forth over the course of decades that were hugely financed to be able to find the holes in everything that they're now executing now. And I just want to make a side comment that Donald Trump is the mastermind of nothing. That guy never put all of this stuff together. He's just a figurehead for all of these other forces that have been at work since you guys have been in the mix, trying to thwart all of these things on behalf of a government that works of, by, and for the people, that, of course, would only have the amount of power after FDR's New Deal to be able to counter what were then the robber barons, which are now the robber barons today, that are absolutely pulling a complete hijacking that started, but manifested. And I'd like you to touchstone upon this, because this is a part so much of your work that you've taught us, Bill, but particularly as it relates to what we saw with the Supreme Court and their decision, to allow, you know, presidential immunity, so to speak, and to be above the law while he is president in the service of the country. So, you know, supposedly, and whatever that means, but that doesn't manifest without the dark money, of course, that's enabled by Citizens United, which creates the ROI that you just discussed. But at the Supreme Court, that we all now understand that has happened. And so all of that stuff was occurring nonstop to get to this point where Rachel Maddow suddenly has the light go on in her head the other day that I started with, that, oh, it's as if Elon is a bank robber and he bought the bank. So, Bill, you've taught us for a long time about a criminogenic environment. Can you dovetail that into Trump's actions, particularly in light of his formula, lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate? The guy's talking about going after corruption. That's absolutely incredible. Talking about audacity.
Right. So a criminogenic environment is simply one in which the incentives are so perverse that it produces widespread criminality, right? And so if you take the police off the beat, if you slash, and again, this is, we've been emphasizing Republicans, but there are a ton of mainstream Democrats that were huge contributors to this as well. So let's give an example, starting with the Democratic administration, of how you create a criminogenic environment that's going to lead to the great financial crisis. You take the FDIC and you cut their personnel by more than 3/4 to save money. And because regulation is evil, you cut the Office of Thrift Supervision, the thrift regulators, by more than half. Right? You order that the enemy is the inspector generals. They demonized the reinventing government thing that was the signature domestic policy of Gore and Clinton. Was the devil incarnate, was the inspector generals. Why? Because June talked about rule followers and rule enforcers. Why do you have an umpire? Why do you have refs? Right? The game works a lot better for the honest, talented people if it's an honest game, right? Otherwise, it can descend into a brutal thing of whoever cheats the most or breaks bones deliberately, et cetera, et cetera. And Clinton and Gore, again, they weren't really the designers. They loved this as a political idea. But the designers were these highly skilled quasi-Democrats who were really, in ideology, Republicans. And they thought the government was the enemy. And what they needed to do was crush it. So their particular advisor's famous phrase was, don't waste 1 minute worrying about fraud. Now think about that. That was the top analytical guy, the guy, as you say, below the scenes, who actually knows where the gears are and how you destroy the system. That the equivalent of the 2020, the Project 2025 guys, right? Who know the vulnerable areas where you put the sand in and the engine grinds itself and explodes in flame and can't be fixed. That's the type of people that they put in. Okay, so come forward. What are the entities that restrict the elite fraudsters? Well, number one on your list would be the Department of Justice. Number two would be the FBI. Number three would be the Inspector Generals. Number four would be the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And then, what have they targeted? Exactly those areas. How could we gain? All right, so this is good. We're just making it more criminogenic by dramatically reducing the risk that will be prosecuted. And we got Fox News, so the risk that will be disclosed and humiliated in the public has gone away. And, the rest of the media is lying low to try to avoid criticism. But we could do better. Now that we control the key levers of government, how can we make it a money machine for us?
Right.
Well, we could order the government to buy Teslas. Lots and lots of Teslas. I'm sorry, not Teslas. The cyber urinal, right?
Right. Well, yeah, exactly.
But an up-armored cyber urinal that'll be even more pathetically incapable of doing anything. But we will put into the law that it's going to be, you're going to buy Teslas, massive numbers of Teslas. Why? Because sales, I'm sorry, not of Teslas, but of the company Tesla, right? Why? Because sales of the Cybertruck, sales of regular Teslas have collapsed in this system.
True.
Well, what else could we do? Well, we could create a sovereign wealth fund. Now that sounds cool. We're
Right.
going to build wealth. What will we have it buy? Whatever we want. Well, who was the big contributors? The cyber bros, right? They got a problem. Their product is, in any economic fundamental sense, useless, close to worthless. But they have a ton of it, and they write all these things about how they're going to make thousands of percent profit. Huh? Well, the only way to do that is have the federal government buy a ton of their cyber crap. And that's precisely what they'll do with your money, my money, to make the cyber bros. So the cyber bros who are really the power in this administration are going to, in the most audacious way that makes zero sense economically on how you would run a sovereign wealth fund, be corrupt. But that is the norm. Norway has a really honest sovereign wealth fund that invests well and has made a ton of money for the people. But notoriously across the world, these sovereign wealth funds are corrupt. They do things like, oh, I don't know, the president's son-in-law gets $2 billion to invest, even though the watchdogs for the Saudi entity say he's completely incompetent, don't do this. In the savings and loan era, the Kuwaiti sovereign wealth fund bailed out Charles Keating, the most notorious fraud. And then the law firm for Keating immediately started researching desperately the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the thing about bribery. What has Trump just done? Talk about creating a criminogenic environment. We will not enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act against bribery. Guess who else is the front lines against corruption? The inspector generals. We'll get rid of them. But in particular, among the inspector generals, the lead anti-corruption guy internationally was the IG for USAID. Precisely because we recognize the danger of corruption in sending foreign funds to a number of these countries, we have a huge effort through that IG and USAID to create capacity to reduce corruption and prosecute corruption. And we had 20 FBI agents specifically assigned, and we have very few FBI agents that do anti-corruption anymore. So this was one of our very important things. Again, Trump is absolutely clueless about this, but the tech bros who are want desperately to bribe public officials, they know these kinds of details. And they're the ones that create this agenda. And this is why Trump's second term is not worse. It is a massively worse iteration of his first term, when he was just had bumbling, corrupt instincts, but was really bad at understanding where the key points of vulnerability, where if I squash this, everything else fails. And that's what's happening today.
Right. As a result of the long haul of the people behind the scenes, of course, in these think tanks and everything else that you just said earlier in the conversation, that know how to come up the works and ultimately how to hijack it. And, for me, the shortcuts are like, Trump's entire formula is to lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. This guy's straight out of Gotham. He's the Joker. And yet he's got all of these people that are actually very dangerous in the sort of armies, if you will, of this dark side of corruption that has completely hijacked the United States, and nobody can deny it right now. And June, I'm reminded of a
Just
couple.
let me add one thing.
Yeah.
Musk, these aren't potential conflicts. Musk was under investigation
Right.
Yes, if you look at Musk's priorities,
by the IGs he got rid of.
right, you will see that the order in which he chose to attack agencies corresponds with agencies that have been investigating him.
Right. And you've got to wonder how much of this was taught to Elon, because I don't think he was aware of this stuff as much 10 years ago as he's evolved into over the course of this time. And we could talk about pump and dump schemes. We could talk about stuff that happened behind the Fed and all the different sorts of scenarios that lead to this sort of final revelation for this first chapter in this introduction to the American people, that we will further introduce more and more players that know how to thwart this. What we have to have is a critical mass of American people coming to the light of truth for salvaging or redeeming the democracy that has been lost to these forces of corruption over the course of decades. We'll never have a complete victory. But June, tell me how you're feeling and what other people might take away, for example, when you consider that the Republicans right now are positioning to increase the debt ceiling by $4 trillion, given everything that they've done during Democratic administrations in that arena, while at the same time cutting taxes for billionaires, simultaneously, immediately taking a bludgeon to the all of the federal assistance to the most vulnerable in society.
So let me say, give a big picture on all of this. If you go back to the 80s and you look both at Jack Welch, who becomes CEO of GE at the beginning of the 80s, and Ronald Reagan, and the generation that came of age during this time period that includes Obama and Clinton, there is this mindset of we have to free up corporate America to compete with the Japanese. We have to get rid of government bureaucracy. And there is, in the Reagan administration, John Roberts, Samuel Alito, the acolytes who will rise to prominence in the new era, who believe in repealing the New Deal. Now add Silicon Valley. The people I know who admire Musk, or admired Musk before he became Trump's hatchet man, admired his ability to jumpstart the EV industry. And the way Musk did it is to ignore regulations. You just do it. We profile at the beginning of our book a young woman. She has a background in the sciences, but the biological sciences. She so admires Tesla's environmental mission that she parks herself outside of their headquarters in Palo Alto, um, finding the right person, and is so persistent they hire her. Originally, she's in the communications office, but eventually she is hired as an automotive engineer, in spite of the fact she knows nothing about automotive engineering, has no experience or training. What brings her to not Musk's, but the supervisor's attention is in her old job, she puts 26 hours straight on the job. And they say, this is the kind of person I want on my team. And she goes to work. And part of what she discovers, aside from the fact that sexual harassment is rampant in the engineering ranks, as it is in most auto companies, she finds out that, hey, there are all these quality defects in Teslas. And she designs a fix for them. And what do? They say, you're interfering with our production. They sideline her, harass her, and retaliate against her for her complaints. And this is the core of what corporate America has celebrates Musk's ability to break through regulations, the opposition of GM and other automotive companies, potential competitors, to flood the market with EVs and change the landscape. Zuckerberg's mantra is move fast and break things. That's Musk's mantra. And the idea is you're breaking through the bureaucracy, you're breaking through the establishment, you're creating something new. And you have to say, with Tesla, Musk did that. But he did that by breaking the rules. And he did that, he became the richest man in the world when you had, within a 2-week period, an announcement that Tesla had exceeded production estimates and that it had 500,000 recalls for product safety issues of its cars. The stock market said, you beat production estimates. Yay. You have product quality. It's not safety, actually, but it's things like trunks opening up on the highway, suddenly without a warning. You have those kinds of product issues. And the stock market shrugged. And Musk had an interview where he admits, hey, don't buy a Tesla during the first production run. We'll work out the kinks in the second production run. He essentially admits that the quality issues were pervasive, but that it was more important to get out to meet production estimates with low-cost vehicles to flood the consumer marketplace and change the nature of the consumer landscape. That's what Silicon Valley admires. And in the case of Tesla, it's a genuine accomplishment, even if he cut corners and committed securities fraud in the process. Now turn to the Supreme Court. And this is the mindset of the Supreme Court. Government regulation hems in the would-be Elon Musks who are transformative. Government bureaucracy is an endless hindrance. It's the Lilliputians holding back the giants who would improve our time. The law profs, William Bowdy in particular at the University of Chicago, wrote a piece saying, hey, the Supreme Court getting rid of government regulation. They've had 2 major cases in the last year or so undermining government regulation. That's entirely consistent with an originalist premise and rigorous judicial methodology. But the Trump immunity decisions and the decision about the interpretation of the 14th Amendment and Trump being able to be on the ballot in Colorado, those are not originalist decisions. And I look at it and say, they're actually driven by the same mindset. The mindset that the great men, and they are men, should be freed from bureaucratic obstruction, that Trump is this outsized figure, that the threat of criminal prosecution is something he could use against Biden. We got to get rid of that. We have to allow people to do the great things and let the market and the voters decide later. And we, the Supreme Court, are in the same ballpark. Ethics investigations? What ethics investigations? We are supreme. We are immune. We don't have to appear before Congress. We don't have to be answerable to anybody. We don't have to follow the same rules we impose on lower mortals, other federal judges. That mindset unites the Reagan era anti-regulatory mindset with the Jack Welch mindset, which was, I have to break through the GE bureaucracy at a time of crisis, with the lack of competitiveness with globalization, and the mindset of Silicon Valley, which is move fast and break things. While we were in San Francisco, we took a Waymo, a driverless car, which hopes to replace Uber. And I said to our son, so how did they get permission to do this? And he said, permission? They didn't ask. They just did it. And that's what Musk is doing to the federal government with no understanding of the incredible losses he is imposing on a system he doesn't understand.
Okay. Bill, we're going to finish up here because obviously of time constraints, but I also want to leave the understanding of the viewers that we're going to continue doing this and we're going to add others moving forward. But what June touched on upon there, it brought me to think of a couple of things that I'd like you to comment on just in closing. And it will be, like always, and I apologize, compounded, but I think it's important to kind of get some of these points across just to give us closure and looking forward, given all of the stuff that we're in the midst of. One, the motivation of the Supreme Court, in addition to maybe ideologically being, I don't know, somewhere Atlas Shrug on this whole thing, which is interesting. And I'll try to bring that full circle to Alan Greenspan, who was a big fan of Atlas Shrug, who ultimately became chairman of the Federal Reserve that preceded all of this stuff. But they were getting paid by a neo-Nazi Harlan Crow, and then a hedge fund guy, Leo Leonard, to fly the upside down flag during the insurrection, while the upside down flag, by the way, was an original symbol for the abolitionist, interestingly enough. But the system's broken already before they came in, right? And so when you're thinking of a bulwark, given everything you guys came from, and ultimately about the DNA of this whole thing, which is exactly how this thing runs from Jack Welch forward. But also, let's not forget the Predators Ball and Michael Milken and all these other things. So, Bill, from where I'm sitting, the only bulwark against this massive bulldozing of separation of powers, constitutional norms, all of the elements that make what was once the greatest democracy maybe in the history of the world, with all of its flaws, but at the same time, where we're going is terrifying and unacceptable. Bill, you are literally the singular guy that has been able to figure this stuff out, get the indictments, get the convictions of 1,700 plus white collar executive criminals back during the savings and loan era. That was the blueprint for everything that's come afterwards. Given this insanity that we're in the midst of, with all of the elements that we've covered, what can we park in the back of our minds looking forward to our next dialogue that you would want Americans to understand, particularly Rachel Maddow, that, the best way to rob a bank is to own one?
Right. So what she's talking about is looting, which is one of the major variants of elite control, fraud, and predation. Right. And what people need to understand is you can get control of the company for small dollars of your money. Right. You can borrow money and then you can use the firm as your victim. You can loot that firm, and there's no one to protect it because you're the CEO in an imperial CEO era. Alan Greenspan said that CEOs in America were dictators, his word. And that was a positive thing for him, by the way, type of thing. So throughout history, in government, in business, or in both, because usually they work together when there's profound corruption, it's going to come from the top. And it's done so from the beginning. The first bank failures in America, 4 of them, all looted by the CEO, right? So we're talking about centuries of experience with this. Now, the Supreme Court is, and the rest of the judicial system is interesting in the United States. On some issues, they're just plain, ripped off the mask and it's a lizard devouring society. But in other technical things, you can still win cases because they want to feel like they're judges, even though they're really not much anymore, a big portion of them. But there's also just a plain portion of folks, whoever appointed them, that want to do the right thing. So don't give up on the courts entirely, but recognize it's not ultimately going to be the place you succeed. Why can you convict still? Because jurors don't like thieves. They particularly don't like powerful thieves. So Trump had to get back in power because he already saw what happens when he went to court. Wherever he was in court, he lost because he lies about everything. And in court, we can take your statements and show that you lied. And then the Trumps of the world think they're really bright and they try to improvise in the deposition or the cross-examination and make up a new lie, except they can be chased down in a judicial system. That's one of the reasons you can be so successful. So let's start with things that we could do to make the world a better place if we actually got a president in the future that wanted to take these folks on. 1, restore the criminal referral system. The FBI doesn't know about these cases unless the regulators tell them about it.
What did we
That's how
discover in
we
the
got.
con, Bill? What did we discover in the con?
That's the con, right? One of the things we discovered. And then under multiple administrations, they diminished. And finally, during the second Bush administration, Bush 2 administration, got rid of the criminal referral system in the banking industry. And the result was you got virtually no prosecutions of the elites that with this massive fraud that drove the great financial crisis. That great financial crisis, the conservative economic estimate, cost 41.7 trillion, that's with a T, dollars in lost GDP. You want an efficiency group? Don't lose 47 trillion to elite fraudsters, right? So 1, restore the criminal referral system. 2, the FBI has been gutted in its white collar prosecutors and investigators in the case of the FBI. Restore it. You make money. You make tons of money net for the government when you do that.
Agreed, but I got to point
Third,
this out at the moment, though, before you go on to the third point. We got Kash Patel about to be confirmed. It's probably confirmed right now. The guy is what, an underscored lackey for whom? I mean, we could go into Kash Patel in another deal, but just the reality now is a boondoggle. But to Bill's point, what he's saying is this is what we, the people, have to create quite frankly, a critical mass to understand what he's saying, so that we can overwhelm that which is basically deceiving us. Go ahead.
we need an agenda for the people going
Yeah.
forward, right? We need to show people that there are a number of areas we know how to succeed that would be transformative economically, but also transformative politically. You need to break the back of plutocrats who are criminals. This administration is demonstrating what we've known for millennia. You know, this is that old line that conservatives claim to believe. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. Mr. Black
Exactly.
and Mrs. June, thank you for your expertise, your time, and I look forward to our ongoing conversations. And it's perilous times, but what I hope you all take away from this conversation, there's easy remedies that are requisite to corruption.
Not easy.
They're not easy.
Not
And
easy.
I want to emphasize what made FDR successful is the fact that the stock market crash was in 1929. He takes office in 1933. There is a Great Depression that has persisted for years at the time he becomes president. And he has control of both houses of Congress, and he ultimately wins over the Supreme Court. Long story. And he is president for 12 years, including World War II. And Thomas Piketty's comment in his book Capital, which is about inequality, is it took two world wars and the Great Depression to wipe out a high percentage of the accumulated wealth of the planet, opening the door for the social welfare democracies in the middle of the 20th century. My takeaway is when you look at dictators, whether dictator CEOs or dictators like Putin, they may have short-term gains. Tesla may be a great accomplishment in some ways, but they inevitably crash and burn because of their own arrogance and hubris. What is going to happen, and I'm happy to predict it, is sooner or later, Trump will crash the US economy, perhaps the global economy. Something will go wrong in the same way Putin erred in invading Ukraine. Trump may bail him out, but it was an incredible miscalculation based on hubris. The war would be over in a matter of days. And the question is going to be, because the plutocrats are now so powerful, you're not going to dislodge them with a criminal referral. You need an entire system, including higher marginal tax rates, designed to limit their power. And that can only happen after a disaster. So I put on my Facebook page the day after the election, how can you have a single party that includes people who correctly feel they're being ripped off and the people like Elon Musk working overtime to rip them off? Only when that breaks, and it will take a crisis to break it, do we have a hope of correcting the system. It is now too entrenched.
Well, I agree with all of that. And I want to provide the caveat to my statement because it was maybe not thought out as well as I wanted it to, the way it came out of my mouth. When I mean easy, from where I'm sitting, and let me just say to the viewers, and that many of those know this, I've been on this journey for now 14 years where I've spent thousands of hours and we've aggregated millions of dollars to put all of this stuff together. And what I mean by easy after that, enormous effort on our part to understand what Bill has been teaching us the whole time, which led us to you as well, right? Is that when you have people that know how the system is supposed to work and have had incredible success doing it, you know you know how to do it. My point is there are those that we're not hearing from. You two in particular, and many others that will join us, that are not the focus of what media has been, that has hid this contextualization for now 14 years that has led to fraud after pervasive corporate fraud. And again, my shortcut to viewers, and you've heard this all the time, and I just got to say this because I do have an audience, but you don't live in a democracy. What we're in the midst of is corporate fascism, undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses the full faith and credit of the United States to guarantee the fraud that has now created fascism. That's what my ultimate end game is, to defeat fascism because of who I am and where I come from. Never again. And when you talk about crisis and you talk about World War I, World War II, and all of those elements, the sacrifice, we had 50 to 70 million people die in those conflicts, maybe more, right? I mean, what I don't want, I don't know why we have to repeat the same mistakes. That's the point that I'm trying to make. Why do we have to repeat the same mistakes, America? You have the information. You just have to act upon it, and we're going to continue to provide you the details so that you understand that there are remedies that are requisite to the corruption. And I guess that's where I'm coming from. And not to challenge you that, of course, it's not easy. But my point is, it can be done. It's not necessary to hope to persevere.
Not easy, but clear.
Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to next, and you guys have a terrific weekend. I will put all of the links to your terrific work, June, particularly, as well as Bill. Again, to remind everyone, the book that June had mentioned, I encourage everybody to go out and get it or order it. Fair Shake: Women in the Fight to Build a Just Economy. And it's absolutely ridiculous, Bill. And it must have made you smile to a degree, but if you haven't seen it, I'll track it down. But Rachel Maddow finally had the epiphany. Oh, Elon is just a bank robber that is buying the bank. You got to be kidding me, Bill. Anyway, go ahead. Any comment on that?
No, if it's almost as if someone had a title, "The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One."
Thank you, guys.
I have to go, but thank you. Fascinating.
All the best to you both. Take care.
Take care.